Before we enter the wild world of postmodern architecture, let's run through a quick review of modern architecture. Remember, art history students nationwide score lowest in architecture questions, so you want to run faster than those other deer. This is Louis Sullivan's Carson Pirie Scott department store. The building employed the new technologies that made skyscrapers possible. Not just steel frames, but also reinforced concrete and elevators. The strength of steel I-beams and reinforced concrete also permitted the large windows and open and flexible interior space, again, important for the building's function as a store. Louis Sullivan's most famous apprentice was Frank Lloyd Wright. Past College Board questions on his work have focused on Wright's efforts to establish an organic relationship between structure and site, his use of cantilevering, and his open plans that focus on the hearth as the center of the home. This famous International Style house embodied the International Style slogans. Less is more, form follows function, buildings should be machines for living. This house also used the most up-to-date technology and materials available at the time, including poured reinforced concrete. Like falling water, it was integrated into its surroundings and had an open floor plan. The Seagram building is in many ways a more typical and famous example of the International Style, which came to be associated with stark glass and steel rectangles that speared up into the sky. The Seagram building is actually a little more ornamental than many of the high office towers that sprouted up after World War II, thanks to the bronze accents and the plaza set back from the street. And here's another past AP question, very similar to the one I first flashed at you. The required works list now skips over another aspect of post-war architecture, architecture that took an organic, even sculptural form, even as it employed new materials such as steel-reinforced concrete. Indeed, because concrete was hardened in molds, it actually lent itself to more sculptural design. Stay tuned for Zaha Hadid. And this was Frank Lloyd Wright's last work. It is not the Guggenheim that appears on our list of required works. Like the Le Corbusier Chapel I just showed you, this building was designed to be a kind of sculpture. We'll get to the other Guggenheim in just a minute, but first let's examine the reaction against International Style. More generational rebellion is on its way. So, this building is not a required work, but you should recognize the architect. He's the same fellow who helped design the Seagram building. And this building was, in some ways, Johnson's apology for all those glass and steel towers that he had foisted on the world. But we can still see a lot of International Style elements here. So, what are they? There's the simple and unornamented exterior that creates a streamlined effect. The building's function is largely evident from its exterior. Again, form follows function. The building retains that basic rectilinear shape, and in general, the design remains highly geometric. So, what elements represent a departure from International Style? Well, it's not a glass box. It's a granite-clad surface, a return to the tradition of using stone for ornamentation and structural support. The building also harks back to history in its decorative effects. So the Baroque pediment at the top was characteristic of Baroque and neoclassical architecture. I have an included example in the corner. The top also rather whimsically resembles 18th century furniture. You saw this quote in your reading, I hope. The 1980s and beyond witnessed widespread rebellion against the uniformity and anonymity of International Style office towers. One criticism leveled against them is that these designs were too generic. They said nothing about the history or culture of the particular community where they were built. In other words, they were too international. National art, identity art, if you will, had become cool again. And finally we get to a required work. So what makes this house postmodern? The geometry is much more whimsical and varied. Remember, this is the guy who wrote a manifesto entitled Complexity and Contradiction in Architecture and a book entitled Learning from Las Vegas. Venturi himself describes this as preferring, quote, messy vitality over obvious unity, unquote. In his design for this house, Venturi referenced early historical styles. He also pretty clearly rejected form follows function. That arch, for example, is almost entirely decorative, although it did serve one function. It hid the family bird watchers from the birds they were peering at. Finally, the house reflected the history and traditions of its particular setting. The architect notes that large wood frame and fieldstone barns built in the 18th century can still be found in northern Delaware, where the house is located, and they served as an inspiration for this design. And here we see that while Venturi borrowed from historical styles, the arch and the column, his work is much less imitative than, for example, Renaissance or neoclassical architects. No Greek temple designer would have gotten away with building those flat columns or choosing a deliberately asymmetric design. Postmodern architects like to mine history for ideas, but they almost never slavishly imitate. And so we see the same whimsy in the house's interior. Postmodern architects are also much less afraid of color. And here's another Venturi house, this one designed for his own mother. And again, we see a decorative arch and a broken pediment. One last Venturi building. Note the variety of geometric forms and the purely decorative elements. Mies van der Rohe would have hated this. So here's a famous postmodern building that's not on the list, but it has appeared on past AP tests. This architect worked with Philip Johnson on the AT&T Sony building. This building makes a more obvious break with international style. After years of emphasizing the vertical, this design reasserts the horizontal. We also see stylized and reinterpreted classical elements, such as pilasters, garlands, and keystones. The multiple colors are another postmodern feature. And so here you see another past exam question. The College Board's scoring rubric notes that both buildings have playful and extravagant forms, often using decoration that is not functional. Again, form is not following function. The design is neither severe nor entirely serious. Both buildings include a whimsical, eclectic mix of historical references. The architects have resisted creating a unified environment. And now we get to where architecture gets truly weird. Your homework mentioned that the Guggenheim Bilbao was the centerpiece of an urban revitalization project for an aging port city, Bilbao, Spain. It did not talk about how the setting and history influenced design. Looking at the building, what does it remind you of? How about a ship with billowing sails? Or maybe even a ship that got blown up by a bomb? Bilbao is, after all, the capital of the Basque region of Spain, a region with an active separatist movement where bombs do periodically explode. It is also an industrial city that has lost much of its industry and needed a repurposed downtown. Gary's museum has proved an extraordinarily successful draw, so popular that efforts to use culture to revitalize cities are now sometimes called the Bilbao effect. This aerial view gives you a better idea of how the museum was anchored to the riverfront, which is now a vast park complex. Gary is also the most famous deconstructivist architect, although, interestingly, he rejects the term. But everybody else seems to think he's a deconstructivist, so let's talk about what that term might mean. Here's the building that thrust Frank Gehry into the limelight. It started off as a generic Dutch-roofed suburban house and morphed into this collection of industrial materials: chain-link fence, plywood, galvanized zinc, cinder block, and exposed wood framing arranged into lopsided cubes. I do wonder what the neighbors thought. Anyway, here is Wikipedia's definition of deconstructivism, which is as clear as anything else I found. Deconstructivism is characterized by fragmentation, an interest in manipulating a structure's surface, non-rectilinear shapes which appear to distort and dislocate traditional elements of architectural structure. Basically, deconstructivist architects embrace unpredictability and controlled chaos. And I mean controlled. To really deconstruct, at least buildings that aren't going to fall down, even if it looks like they're about to fall down, also requires a computer. These twisting curves are mathematically extremely complex. They were designed using a 3D design software called CATIA, which allows architects to create complex designs and make calculations that would have not have been possible even a few years ago. Essentially, the software digitizes points on the edges, surfaces and intersections of Gary's hand-built models to construct on-screen models that can then be manipulated in the manner of animated cartoons. The building's walls and ceilings are load-bearing, containing an internal structure of metal rods that form grids with triangles. CATIA calculated the number of bars required in each location, as well as the bars' positions and orientation. The walls and ceilings have several insulating layers and a thin outer coating of titanium. Why titanium? Okay, this is where I started geeking out, and I found a National Geographic engineering video that answers that question. Here's our last required image from this work. It demonstrates how carefully the building was designed to suit its riverside site and the industrial surroundings that it both echoed and transcended. I'm going to show you 3 other Frank Gehry deconstructivist buildings, all very distinctive. I'm struck that most of these deconstructivist buildings are either cultural centers or university buildings. In other words, works designed for patrons who might be somewhat more tolerant of highly experimental, even slightly weird designs, and maybe patrons whose functional demands are more flexible. It's hard to see any of these functioning as an office building. Our final architectural work is also a museum designed by Iraqi-born British architect Zaha Hadid. She died in 2016, and her obituaries repeatedly note that she is one of the most acclaimed female architects, and indeed most acclaimed architects working in the 21st century. This building is a museum of contemporary art. Its companion museum features 21st century architecture. Since we've raced through 20th and 21st century architecture today, let me ask, where would you place this work? It is not an international-style glass, steel, and metal box, but neither is it quite as deconstructed as Gehry's Bilbao Museum. The columns and overhang remind me somewhat of the Villa Savoy, and the material once again is molded concrete. On the other hand, the architect is clearly playing with geometry in an innovative and maybe slightly disruptive way. She has also, like Gehry, sought to integrate her design into its urban setting. Architecture Today commented that, quote, a pedestrian walkway follows the outline of the building, restoring an urban link that had been blocked for almost a century by the military barracks that previously occupied the site. Hadid acknowledged that she was strongly influenced by Russian revolutionary art and architecture, the geometric suprematist paintings of Kazimir Malevich, and constructivist architecture. On the right, you see a famous example of constructivist architecture from a period when Soviet leaders were still encouraging artistic experimentation. You may recall Stalin put an end to that. It's a little hard to see this from the required images, but this virtual plan makes the design clear in my view. Basically, it's composed of bending oblong tubes that overlapped and intersect, almost like a cloverleaf on an interstate highway. The curved sidewalls are made of concrete with internal stairways of black painted steel. So I hope you have time to watch this short video made by Zaha Hadid's architectural firm. It includes the architect's explanation of what she was hoping to accomplish. Think about whether she succeeded, whether this form will indeed suit the function of a multi-purpose, multicultural art center. And here are a couple more Zaha Hadid buildings. Note that both highly geometrical and irregular, less whimsical than postmodern architecture, but maybe not quite as deconstructed as Frank Gehry's works. On to the equally wild world of video art.